Good morning and welcome everyone to our webinar, Rebuilding the Creative Economy. I'm Professor Joanne Seiss. I'm Executive Dean of UniSA Creative here at the University of South Australia. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is established on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage beliefs and relationship with the land, and we acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. I also extend that same respect to Aboriginal peoples from other areas of South Australia and Australia who are present today. Firstly, a few housekeeping items to mention before we progress. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing in the coming days. Following the panel presentation, there will be a live Q&A, and our panellists are going to be really keen to receive your questions. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with the Q&A, there should be a button located at the bottom of your screen and you can enter questions for the panel there. We'll do our best to answer your questions, and we do appreciate your patience as we make our way through the presentation. So let's commence, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Adrian Franklin is Professor of Creative Industries and Cultural Policy at the University of South Australia. He trained in social anthropology and has held professorial positions in the UK, Europe, and Australia. Recently, his research has looked intensively at the range of museums and cities around the world that have attempted to break free from the limitations of conventional museology models. Hello, Adrian.
Hi.
Also joining us is Susan Luckman. Susan is Dean of Research in UniSA Creative, and she is Director of CP3, Creative People, Products and Places, a research concentration at the University of South Australia. She has received numerous Australian Research Council and European Union research grants to explore employment and enabling ecosystems in the creative sector. She has authored many books and publications in this area. Apologies for that interrupted introduction, Susan, but welcome to you.
Thanks, Jo, and hello, everybody.
Our third panellist is Justina Jochum. Justina is CEO at Festivals Adelaide, the strategic umbrella organisation of South Australia's 11 festival entities. Justina also serves on various boards, such as the Tourism Industry Council of SA, Writers SA, and she is part of the executive committee for the peak body, the Arts Industry Council of South Australia. Thank you for joining us, Justina.
Good morning. Thank you, Jo.
As we know, the creative industries is crucial to building a dynamic economy that provides job opportunities, fosters entrepreneurialism, innovation, cultural identity, and overall enrichment, vibrancy, and well-being within our society. Along with other areas, the cultural and creative sectors have been hit hard by COVID-19. Many businesses, galleries, festivals, and other events have been closed, cancelled, or postponed. So where to from here, and what can we do to restore and continue to nourish this most important sector? For example, as of May this year, 90% of museums around the world were closed, with almost 13% under serious threat of never being able to reopen. Adrian, much of your research has examined how museums around the world have attempted to break free from the limitations of conventional models. And this is timely, isn't it, considering the state of the world now? Can you tell us how museums have responded to the COVID-19 crisis and what effect this may have on visitor experiences and how we engage with cultural artefacts?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's been this joyful upwelling of written expressions from art museum directors doing all kinds of things that we might have expected and things that we would never have dreamed of. Things like reversals, renewals, renewals of quite old museum vows that had been let go, a lot of experimentation, and something they're calling localization. And other commentators like me have called this activity the insights from trauma. And I'll talk a little bit to that and some of the things they've been doing. So a vocal group of art museum directors and professionals have really asserted that they want to revalue priorities and restructure their operations. They want to retain as well as discard some of their operations into the future. They want to celebrate the local more. They want to engage the public more through dialogue rather than communicating information directly to them and marketing online and then just not really appearing before them once they get to the museum. They want to actually be in dialogue with the public, really for the first time on quite a scale. They want to lighten the atmosphere in their museum spaces. They've always been rather stiff and reverent. I think they've seen a few models in the past which have lightened the atmosphere that have worked very well. So they're going with that. They want to return to showcasing their collections more, and we're going to see more of their collections. They want to engage in courageous experimentation. And they want to avoid in the future being seduced by the return of mass tourism, if that ever happens. And so they are more aware of and want to avoid the dangers of pre-COVID normal, as they're calling it. So during this time, COVID-19 has closed most art museums for long spells. Some, as you said, Joe, will close forever. On April the 7th this year, I Lost My Gig reported that lost income had reached 330 million and impacted the lives of over 600,000 artists and art workers. And by May, the Grattan Institute predicted half of all workers in the arts and recreation industry would lose their jobs. And you get things like the New York Times magazine's Jerry Saltz with an article that was headlined "The Last Days of the Art World." Now, look, we've seen that before, but this extravagant art world, they're all calling it extravagant, too extravagant, was fueled by this seemingly endless supply of cash, attended by an expanding, perfectly mobile international audience at ever more astonishing temples of art. And this just seemed to them now unlikely to continue, at least in its present form. Art had become the ultimate sign of distinction for cities that had everything but wanted to compete hard for even bigger global shares. And this whiff of decadence and danger was always part of its charm, but this was no longer charming, and it had become something of a corporate feeding frenzy. And it was also something that artists and many of their followers actually railed against. And I think it was not always what art museum professionals had in mind when they were pondering their calling. So they saw this as an opportunity to make some pretty drastic changes. And as David Ley, the social geographer, David Ley, reminded us, that capital really loves art for all the excess value that spills over into the cups of developers, property owners, and retail. But art does not always love capital back as much. So I'll just go on now to some of the things that they've come up with. Because COVID-19 has ended the overdetermination of tourism in museum practice and opened up a kind of time and a space in their minds to consider alternative practice and spaces, it's been for them a kind of upside down, topsy-turvy time where everything in the past was suspended, and it's encouraged a lot of playful carnivalesque behavior, both by art museums and their audiences. And we'll see some of that in a minute. I'll talk to that. And it's true, when communities of any scale come under attack, it often produces not only heightened forms of social solidarity, but it also produces a felt need to affirm their ties and community values, or change them. And I would say that there's evidence recently that art museums feel they've got a role to play here. So this will involve a considerable degree of innovation in the use of buildings, in spaces beyond the museum, in their communications and online technologies, and even robotics, the materialities of art, the nature of engagement with an art museum's collection, and the balance between local and visitor communities. So one of our great museum directors, Nick Mitsevich, who's at the NGA, said the other day that, you know, without the coronavirus, they would have been more precious. And I think we can take him to mean plead more strongly than usual to their conventional norms, with their great priorities on art history and physical exhibition. And he is actually wanting to scrap art labels, you know, museum labels. I mean, this is an extraordinary thing to do. And it actually reminds me of David Walsh when he started Mona. He scrapped them, and it was a big outcry about it. But Nick's not only doing it, he's experimented with it and thinks that it can produce a better audience experience. Others have said that they need to be more inspiring of their communities, whether local or global, play a bigger role as a kind of community and cultural centre for their community. They're talking about scaling back the building expensive buildings. The clamour to expand after 2008, after the 2008 recovery, should not be repeated. And museums might programme outside their walls as they do building and renovation. Costly commissions with artists, celebrity artists, may be curtailed, and a dramatically altered art market will present the opportunity to recalibrate relationships between museums and the commercial art world. As you probably know, most art museums have been priced out of contemporary art for many years now. So clearly, social inclusion, diversity, collaboration, and decolonization are going to be priorities for the future. A recent RMIT report on art museums and COVID-19 concludes that museums can become shared civic spaces where audiences of members and visitors can participate in making digital content that inspires learning, interaction, and broaden world's views, grounded always in local connections that responds to diversity in all its forms. In March 2020, the Courtauld Virtual Gallery, just one I'd selected randomly, had an astonishing 723% spike in online visitors. And this has become over COVID-19. And this increase in traffic and the changing orientation of online relationships has actually changed art museums' total control over online communications. They've invited a more dialogical relationship so that information and creativity is going both ways. Interpretation is going both ways. And this was quite an extraordinary thing for them to do. It gives visitors more control, if you think about it, over the time they spend with art, as well as the changing pattern of engagement. So they can go in for fleeting visits, just go in to read an interview, or maybe see one new work of art, or perhaps go in for longer and deeper concentration on a single issue, maybe over days or even weeks. And talking of the playfulness that was all around this period, especially in the beginning, the Getty team decided to use social media to emphasize initiatives that were participatory or created conversations, with the goal of publishing the content that was that came back to them. And this was really uplifting, inspirational, and it really did show you how a bigger, wider, more local community could be produced. And they did it by issuing a challenge to their social media followers to create a work of art using items available to them at home. 3 items they could use, and they had to recreate a work of art in the Getty collection. This has proved, virally popular and global. And it's generated a great deal of activity and sense of community on social media at a time when people were looking for art making ideas.
Thank
Here
you.
in Adelaide, the museum. Oh, sorry. Do you want me to stop now?
I'm mindful of time, Adrian, and I want to just delve a little more deeply because those examples that you've just provided have just been fascinating. And I guess a follow-up and perhaps a final question before we move on to our next panelist is, given those tensions that you've described between the, obviously with those examples, the success of making, I guess, a more quick engagement, albeit online, and the realistic restrictions of COVID that are still likely to be with us, for some months, if not longer. What impact is that going to have on, I guess, the collections, the actual artefacts, physical artefacts, and I guess what we've traditionally always regarded as the way of curating those artefacts? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think we're going to see an end to the blockbuster monopoly or equivalent in the smaller spaces. And because that takes up a lot of time and resources. So A, they won't be able to afford it, and B, there won't be the crowds to justify it. But they will be able to get more out from under their stores, stuff that we've never seen before. So I'm really excited because there's a hell of a lot of museums of art that I've only seen a tiny fraction of their stuff. So they will be reopening. And it's going to return to maybe their collections a little bit more. Maybe there's going to be more kind of spaced out activities, maybe more panel discussions, and maybe they'll be taking works of art outside, maybe through showing them in schools or community centres or prisons or wherever. They've realized that there's so much they can do. There's so many examples of this good stuff. So I think we will see the inside of a museum again physically, but it's not going to be the same one.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much, Adrian. I want to turn the discussion now to the festival sector. So Justina, research has shown that events, festivals, public activity plays an important role in our community life, and that attending festivals and events has so many benefits, such as building social connections. What's next for festivals and other creative and cultural events, given the restrictions that have come about this year due to COVID?
Thank you, Jo. So you're absolutely right. For decades, festivals have been a growing cultural phenomenon, and for a number of cities around the globe, they have become really fundamental to their identity and economic success. So the constraints related to mass gatherings and the necessary health restrictions have really meant that globally, the live event sector was among the first to be affected and will be among the last to return. To contextualize, in Australia, a recent report by EY titled The Economic Cost of COVID-19 on Australia's live entertainment industry indicated that the pandemic has led to the fall of 65% of economic output for the live events industry, from 36.4 billion in the past year to 12.8 billion this year. So that equates to a loss of 23.6 billion in economic output. And in terms of full-time equivalent jobs, the losses are estimated at nearly 2/3 of the workforce, which is quite dramatic. And this case is not unique. Similar impacts of the pandemic are felt across the globe. And they are certainly not limited to economic consequences, as you've pointed out. The impacts have really included effects on the global movement of artists, arts companies, and festival workers. Festivals exist as international circuits. The effects can be also felt on cultural tourism, which was among the fastest growing visitor segments globally, social connection, the mental health and physical health of our artists, creatives, and festival workers, but also trade and investment, philanthropic practices, CBD and city center activation, volunteerism, arts education. And what the pandemic really exposed is the precariousness of employment in the arts and gig economy. So we've also seen very serious strain and stress on the business models of arts enterprises, affecting publicly funded and commercial entities very differently. And as such, insurance has become a really hot button issue, with it becoming increasingly difficult to access proper coverage necessary for festivals and events to come back. So we have seen several federal schemes and proposals developed in partnership to really address this challenge in various countries, and here at home in Australia, but also Austria and the UK. We also observed that a big component of the sector's initial response pertained to the digital shift, which we are all familiar with. Festivals really tried to quickly identify new avenues to reach audiences, but also develop alternative income streams and opportunities for artists and festival workers. That sparked robust debates about appropriate rights and compensation for artists, companies, and festival businesses alike in the digital space, but also how these platforms can be used for international connection, continued cultural diplomacy, and engagement, which festivals have become really significant players in. Adrian already mentioned the survey I Lost My Gig, launched to track those immediate losses in the industry. But it's also worthy to mention that festivals undertake extensive infrastructure requirements from stages to tents to catering, sanitation, traffic control. So the cancellation of these events have really affected opportunities to hire other SA businesses to help organize those festivals. Similarly, festival patrons who often pay for food and beverages, goods and transport tickets will have different capacity to do so. And we really won't know what that looks like until we have festivals come back and audiences come back to them. So festival cities around the globe will be addressing these vulnerabilities in different ways, but I think there are some overlapping priorities for the festivals moving forward. And these include identifying and executing R&D initiatives, really boosting professional development in the sector and taking this time to do so, amplifying entrepreneurial skills and capacities, especially in the areas of funding, diversification, sponsorship, and fundraising, incentivizing innovations that require collaboration between different priority growth areas for our cities and regions. This might be in international education, tourism, health, and well-being. Also increasing accessibility to tech and digital solutions, and we see that there's discrepancy in this area between cities and regional areas as well as all over the world. And so it becomes a question about how to embed these solutions in festivals and make them extensions and enhancements of the festival experience. We're also going to be seeing as a priority the leveraging of our international networks and cooperating more effectively and practically and genuinely. As I mentioned, the festival sector is a global circuit, and of course the pandemic has thrown a major hitch in that. But it is a circuit that requires and relies on mobility and partnerships and more platforms for artists to be able to get their work across to new audiences and to make an income from it. So maintaining those networks and those relationships is going to be really crucial. And lastly, a major area is going to be cultural tourism and how we can further use festivals and events to draw visitors to the city and the state. So the question really for us is, what does it mean to be a festival city in a pandemic, and what does it mean to be a festival city post-pandemic? In Adelaide, we can already observe really fresh approaches to collaboration and city policy, a really invigorated conversation around cultural tourism, new technology development and R&D innovation as a response to pandemic, but also a discussion that is increasingly vibrant about the role of festivals in city making and their contribution to regional development. As such, this year we decided as a sector to to really embrace the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a framework that will help us to advance the arts and community development, employment, health and well-being, and all these policy domains that the festivals touch in a more systematic and strategic way. And for those who don't know, the UN SDGs, as they are commonly called, are 17 global goals that were agreed upon by 193 UN members, including Australia. And these goals aim to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. And we understand festivals to be a really key part of that equation. So we want to advance the sector connections and ground the festival sector in the UN Sustainable Development Goals moving forward. This is going to be a really crucial priority for us. And yeah.
Sorry, Justin, continue, please.
So I will just end there and say that Festivals Adelaide is, as you mentioned, an industry association. It's an alliance, and it's an instrument that was developed by 11 of our major arts and cultural festivals. It's a really unique entity because we get to do a lot of this thinking and connection and to support the sector in ways that is not common. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do so. And I think moving forward, cooperation between festivals and their adjacent sectors and festival cities globally will be really integral to the renewal and regeneration of this international festival circuit that I spoke of.
Thank you so much, Justina. I wanted to just follow up quickly on that last point, in fact, that given the fact that festivals can be, as you've described with Festivals Adelaide, such a critical local and immediate regional entity and combination of events and activities that has so many benefits for society, but simultaneously has this incredible global network of the connected festival cities and this collective adoption of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. What do you think are the key partnerships or collaborations, the priority ones that festivals should be seeking? Is it largely with the tourism sector? Is it with other sectors as well?
Oh, absolutely. Tourism is a major one, but I also think that there's a lot of opportunity to explore further the interface of health and well-being, quality education and reduction of inequalities. Climate action is a really big priority and an intersection that the festivals have been increasingly doing a lot of work in. So really the sky's the limit for festivals and the sectors and industries that they do touch and the policy domains that they can advance. I believe I share the belief with all of my members that festivals are agents of change, and it is about connecting with those adjacent sectors so that we can optimize the change that we do see and that we do advance.
And I guess the really comprehensive overview that you provided a bit earlier around the magnitude of the broader connections to festivals, the supporting pipeline of organisations and other sectors that go into enabling festivals to happen, that when you extend beyond the events themselves, it is actually they're huge undertakings that do have connections into all areas of our operation and endeavour, regardless of whether or not you're a festival attendee yourself or otherwise. Really fascinating and such important considerations. Thank you, Justina. Susan, to you. Many people in the cultural and creative industries who've experienced the hardships associated with the COVID pandemic might well now be thinking or have started to make forays into pursuing new careers or employment in other industries. And many people who perhaps might have, previously been considering career in the creative industries might in fact be reconsidering their options. What are some of the heightened challenges for professional creative practitioners, and how do you think we can address those challenges moving forward?
Thanks, Jo. The other speakers have already highlighted some of the key challenges here, and I'll get onto those in a second, and the impacts upon this particular sector. But I suppose I'll start with slightly good news come out to begin. Overnight, we heard word that in the UK, our first COVID vaccine has been rolled out. So fingers crossed, we are going to be talking about a world where we get back to some kind of post-COVID normal. Now, what that looks like, as Adrienne and Justina have both mentioned, will be different. But one of the reasons the sector has been particularly hard hit is because, especially in the performance area, as well as in galleries, museums, etc., the sector relies upon lots of people together in close proximity, often indoors. And so couple that with the fact that activities like choirs and singing, orchestras require people to be projecting their voices, their breath quite profoundly. These are just activities that had to shut down immediately. So fingers crossed, in the post-COVID normal, these things will start to get back to some kind of normal. But obviously there are wider issues here, and the sector has been particularly hard hit. There are a number of other reasons for this, and one of the key ones is because it is a complex ecosystem which consists of many large cultural institutions, as we've already seen, but as evidenced by, for example, the festival circuit, perhaps in particular, it's also one area of the economy that has a huge number of self-employed, sole trader, casualised, contract-based employment. So as a result of COVID-19, the sector has been hit because huge numbers of its workforce just didn't have access to a lot of the protections that either more full-time employment affords. People weren't able to necessarily always work from home, and certainly they didn't have the protections of things like job seeker and job keeper. At least job keeper was certainly something that many people found very hard to qualify for, given the casualised nature of the workforce. So this has been one of the reasons why this sector, on top of those other kinds of just more structural issues of the kinds of activities that underpin it, couldn't go on. It's also about the nature of the employment relationships here. And I think not just for the creative sector, but more broadly, COVID has really revealed that we need to be much more attentive in our policy settings to the impacts of casualised employment. Everything from the absence of sick leave to be able to stay at home when you've been diagnosed or had a test, through to the complex realities of what it means for a workforce and a sector where, fingers crossed, we don't lose too many of these people in a year or 2 years' time when we want to ramp things up again. Because this is one of the threats, that huge amounts of expertise, of knowledge, of skills will be lost to the creative sector as people just had to go and pursue other opportunities in the meantime. And this is one of the great challenges moving forward. So at the recent launch of the South Australian Government's Creative Industries Strategy, Dale Roberts, the Managing Director of COJO, referred to the need to extend out for the creative sector more proper jobs. We need more proper jobs in the sector. And I can only say yes, absolutely, we need more proper jobs moving forward in the sector. But the reality of casual work and contract-based work is going to stay with us. So moving forward, one of the key things we need to think about, governments especially need to think about, is how can we better support in our policy settings these kinds of sectors that are heavily reliant on these kind of employment modes. One starting point would be, a very basic one, is just to take for granted that this is a normalised form of employment for many people. Portfolio work, whereby you put together a number of different jobs as part of your career, is the new normal for huge numbers of the world's workforce. It's certainly how many people in creative practice support themselves. So we need to think about things as basic as, in statistics, how do we account for this? One of the great challenges for many of us working in the creative industries is, if you want to measure the employment and other kinds of economic impacts of the sector, it's almost impossible to use things like census data. The census asks us, what was the main occupation or main job we worked last week? It doesn't say, and what were the 3 other jobs you've had in the last month that also help support you through that? Where have you volunteered? What other activities have you engaged in? We just don't have the data and the information to support policy that really reflects the reality of people's working lives. So that's one place where we need to start. Another one I will refer to is, we need to think more about how the sector itself and individual workers can work collaboratively to support themselves. And I want to draw upon some research that's been undertaken in the EU SMART, S-M-A-R-T, is a cooperative of freelancers that is active in 9 European countries. It was created in 1998 as a non-profit supporting artists in particular, but now supports artists, creative sector workers, and even Uber drivers and a huge number of casualised workers. It's now got over 100,000 members, and effectively you pay a levy, and that goes into support the infrastructure, the business infrastructure of this particular collective. The collective will do things like manage your accounts, do the invoicing, manage the contracts, pay your insurance. They can pay you up front the money you're going to receive from your contract, or sort of offer it on a sort of more regular basis so that you can support yourself while you're doing that work. They can also collectively bargain for you and provide co-working spaces. So it's just a new kind of collective model that brings together and offers the kinds of supports that those of us fortunate enough to have employment in a more traditional kind of institution have, but provides that for people who are more individualised in their working lives. I also just wanted to take up something Justina referred to, and that was the generosity, and I think that the collaboration across the sector. It's a highly interconnected ecosystem, and I do want to just say that one of the lovely things that's been apparent in South Australia, and I'm sure elsewhere, but certainly it's been palpable here, is how the sectors work together to support itself and one another. There's been a huge amount of collaboration. There's been a huge amount of reaching out to one another to think about how people can work together. And that includes the sector reaching out to us in universities, for which we're incredibly grateful. The need to work together and to support one another is important. I was really, Justina, you referred to professional development. And I know I've been recently doing some research into Guildhouse's history, over 20-year history of providing fantastic mentorship programs. And I know they continue to be an incredibly valuable part of what's going on out there in the creative ecosystem, and one's certainly in demand now as people maybe look to take the opportunity to reskill, shift their practice, move into different avenues for distribution and marketing or display. And this is an important part of our local ecosystem, this kind of structured and supported collaborative activity. It's also important too, as people seek to think about new ways of creating incomes in the moment. One of the great things about Guildhouse and other organisations like that is they do some of that work that SMART does in terms of providing insurance. I know one of the great areas of demand at the moment is a lot of people who are working from home or not able to travel, or just there's been a real widespread rediscovery of the joy of making. So one of the areas of growth for people has been in teaching opportunities where they've been able to be done in a COVID-safe environment. So the insurance that's offered by organisations like Guildhouse is invaluable when you're having people come into your studio and picking up sharp tools or doing other potentially kinds of dangerous things, or even just potentially tripping over a cord. So there's ways in which people are seeking to pivot, even at the individual worker level, to keep moving at the moment, because the impact, as we know, has been profound.
That's wonderful, Susan. Thank you for that comprehensive insight into the realities of people's lives who are, variously employed in this most important sector. A quick follow-up question, and we don't have too much time left because I really want to move into the Q&A, but you did mention one quite specific example of how government settings the reference to the census data collection to acknowledge and recognise the contract or casual employment and how that contributes to the creative sector. Are there other ways and other actions that governments can actually take, do you think, to quite practically support this sector, particularly at this time?
This is an important one because the arts and cultural sector in Australia has been one that has been largely handed over to individual organisations, and certainly the states and territories. It's been years since Australia's had a national cultural policy document. A lot of the peak support organisations that we just took for granted as a part of our important arts and cultural landscape are either ceased to exist or have been defunded. And it's a space in which I think the government needs to move back into. One of the things about that shift to a renewed love of making and appreciation of art was, we all know how quickly when, in March, our world changed. So many of us turned to the internet to access museums, performances, musicians. We DIY'd stuff at home. we really turned arts and creative practice as a source of joy, of shared humanity, of just something to get us through this complex moment in our histories. And I think this really is a moment where hopefully we can see a revaluation of arts and creative activity as an important part of who we are as humans. There's a reason why when we send stuff off into space to go out into the world to boldly find new worlds, we put orchestral pieces on there to say, this is who we are. It's a fundamental part of the human condition. So I definitely think moving forward, hopefully this can be a moment whereby when people talk about the need for government funding and what's in it for the community, it won't just be about those economic impacts. It'll be about why this is important to us, just as education is important to us, health is important to us, arts and culture are important to us as well.
That's a really powerful statement to conclude the panel discussion on. Thank you, Susan. I really want to open up to the Q&A now. So please use the question button, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens to submit your questions. And let me know if you'd like to direct your question to a particular panelist. I should be able to work it out, but if there was a particular panelist that you'd like to respond, please put that in your question as well. So there's a few questions that have come through, and the first one I'll direct initially at you, Adrian. It's to do with regionalities. So the question is, what about regional galleries and museums? What can they do to stay open, considering they may not have the access to all of the resources and I guess the visitation of some of the larger cities? And then I'll, perhaps if you can respond first, and then I'll see if Susan and Justina had any additional thoughts on that point.
Yeah, it's a good question, because as you say, they are seemingly more reliant on visitors, but it does kind of depend. A lot of them have been incredibly successful in building, you know, large, dare I say, captive local audiences. So almost everyone supports. I mean, I'm thinking the Bendigo Gallery here. You know, it's a great gallery, but everyone for miles and miles and miles around, including Melbourne, go along to its stuff, and it does amazing things, fashion, all sorts of stuff. So my first answer is, well, if they carry on doing what they've been doing, they'll be okay, because they will be supported. They can. They've got lots of space. You know, unlike the city centre ones, they have got a lot more space that's not so expensive around them to play in, and they'll be able to do that. They, as much as anyone else, has got big collections that never see the light of day. They'll be able to do that more. And also, I mean, they will have learned through COVID just the range of things that they can do online that were never considered viable, like getting people to be creative themselves, to share that creativity, whether it's expression or actual artworks of any kind. They can get involved in that. And museums have realized that the public is interested in what the public produce. Public, they're clever, you know, and they've never really been trusted. They've always been these people in need of instruction, and I think that has changed. We're now interested in what they say and do.
Thank you, Adrian. Any further comments from Susan or Justina on regionality, perhaps generally, for other activities, including maybe festivals or other events, as well as museums and galleries?
Maybe not. I was thinking more in terms of galleries, and I absolutely support what Adrian said. There's some fantastic ones around, including here in South Australia. I'm just hoping that now could be a moment when they can capitalise upon the captive markets of tourists that can't go to Bali anymore and can't go often interstate, but can drive to Murray Bridge, can drive to the Barossa. Fingers crossed, this could be a moment when, because of increased local tourism, they could actually really come into their own. So it's another area in which maybe some greater support from local councils and government to make them part of the regional tourism boost that's required now could be a really key initiative moving forward.
Thanks, Susan. Justina, I can see you nodding away there too, because that connects to all of your points around tourism. The interconnections are so important, right?
It does, Joe, and that's why a tactical approach to cultural tourism in South Australia is really necessary. We have all the assets. It's just about how do we uh, approach it strategically and help to connect the dots where those connections might not be so present yet.
Fabulous. Another question I'm going to move on to is a specific one, Susan, for you, and it's picking up on the comment you made controversially about proper jobs. So the question is, could you expand on that concept? What do you mean by a proper job in the creative industries? What would that be? You know, there is obviously a broad assumption that these aren't proper jobs. Why does this perception continue to persist?
And I was quoting Dale from Kojo then. I better definitely clarify that what he meant wasn't a dismissing of any kind of work in the creative industries, quite the contrary. It was about a reference to jobs that give you income security, access to sick leave, a job that actually has a livable income and a livable working conditions around it. It was absolutely nothing to do with the quality or the value of work in the creative sector, quite the opposite. Why the perception, though, does persist out there. One of the things I was referring to, or we need to rethink perhaps around creative work, is perhaps because it's so individualized, it's really hard to make the case for why this is actually something that's a public good and not just an individual pleasure. I think the shift to and greater emphasis upon collectively organising and being able to make the case for whole sectors is an important part of this. It isn't just something that I do because I want to do it. That's great, and that's why a lot of people do it. It's also why a lot of people are in other industries as well. But to be able to make the case for why this is important to us as a community, that includes the economic arguments, but not only, I think is something we need to give thought to. And I think COVID gives us an opportunity to do a reset on that. The art and culture are important. They are important to what we do, who we are, and to our economies, and to the employment they offer, and to tourism, and to other sectors. And we really need to do a better job, perhaps, of communicating this. But it's very hard to do it for individuals to do that. This is where we need the resourcing of communities, of collective organisations, and quite frankly, of government.
Thank you, Susan, and the point you did make earlier around the case for equivalence in terms of importance to the community, along with health and education, and that will take a collective and a strength of collective voice. Thank you. Questions are rolling in thick and fast, so I'm going to go to a festival question. So a question perhaps for you to lead off with, Justina. Are there discussions between states to invite share festivals around the world? The examples given, bringing Sydney Vivid Festival to Adelaide, for example, or expanding a festival like WOMAD to another capital city. Are you aware of any of those discussions? But I am also conscious, Justina, that you're not able to speak on behalf of any particular specific festival, but if you could answer that under the auspices of Festivals Adelaide and your role as CEO, that would be fantastic.
Well, I think there's a wonderful example of that already taking place with the Jaipur Literature Festival that comes to Adelaide as part of AusAsia. So certainly those trends are happening, and they have proven incredibly successful for cultural diplomacy, but also exposing audiences to new art, new artists, and experiences that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So I think it's a really fascinating area for programming, for collaboration, and for partnership development. So absolutely something I'm sure the festivals are looking at for the future.
It's great, and Jaipur Literature Festival is such a good example. Thank you, Justina. Another question in, back to you, Adrian, this one. Question, can you speak on some specific strategies or case studies that you know of? I think you did mention a few in your earlier initial discussion, but in terms of museums, and what blows your mind in terms of something that you've seen a museum lead with that is really completely unprecedented and innovative?
Okay, well, I mentioned that the Getty. I mean, we got now. Who are the Getty? I mean, they are a very highbrow art institution, and for them to invite people to make humorous artworks on the theme of one of their own artworks, you know,
Mm.
using 3 household objects to hand during COVID, you know, lockdown. I mean, you know, we've had one of the Munch Scream. It's done. It's like the head is a biscuit, an iced biscuit with a face put on it, and it's on a piece of toast. But it really does look like the Scream, you know. And it's sort of very very well done. But it's a spoof. It's a joke. It's a bit of a laugh, and I think you know that's them saying that's them lightening their tone a little bit, but also but then there were other ones like some serious pieces of art have been recreated by people at home in a very very serious ways, and I mean they're so spookily updated to the present day that they are an interesting artwork in themselves. It's like, what is it like to be a miserable somebody from Sydney, you know, as opposed to a couple of miserable people with a couple of hay forks in America in the early part of the 20th century. So so that example I've used, but I really liked the Democracy Museum in Adelaide's initiative to do, what's it called, Susan Stitch, and it was about, anyway, they invited people to do
Yeah.
cross stitch to express an issue in democracy that is currently topical, and to express it, you know, using, so it taught people how to do cross stitch for one thing. So so people gained the skill, but then they could use it to express something. You know, so one of them I liked was women shouldn't just be in the House, they should be in the Senate as well. You know, it's a really, you know, clever bit of, you know, art expression.
They're great examples. Thank you. And they do, each one of those kind of is the complete antithesis to the foundations of the institutionalized role that traditionally museums and galleries have been expected to perform in society. Exactly. We're running out of time. There's a couple of questions left that I really want to get to. I'm going to combine a couple and to the people have queried them. I hope you don't mind. So there's a bit of a theme coming through the questions around, you know, has COVID changed things forever? You know, will we ever go back? And then the associated line of questioning is moving to the digital and the online, which you've all made reference to varying degrees in your discussions so far. And the fact that while digital access and online engagement is fabulous and open to all, it doesn't always work well with the tactility and the close user experience, if you like, or visitor experience of an object or, you know, artifacts. How can we address that? Is it here for good, and is it just going to become, you know, part of our normal expectation, or are there ways that we can negotiate through the benefits of the digital but still retain you know, that really important connection with the object and the close connection with it? Adrian, I think your hand kind of went up there a bit.
Yeah, it did go up a little bit. Well, yeah, there are lots of examples of hope in this area. I mean, one I liked was one from Hastings Contemporary, a museum in Hastings, and you'll know it if you've ever watched Foyle's War, because that's where Foyle's War was set, in Hastings. And they have been experimenting with robotics to enable disabled people to come to the museum, but not to come to the museum just to see artworks that have been selected and framed online, but to give them the controls at home to move the robot around the museum. It's fabulous. And now everyone likes doing it. You know, children can do it. See, children have been disenfranchised from, you know, or pushed off into children's rooms. And I remember being impressed by that at Mona. Children were allowed to kind of run around and you know, be themselves in Mona, which was quite unusual. So yeah, those are two examples, I think, that I've seen.
Thank you. Thank you. Susan or Justina, anything that you've been aware of that you'd like to contribute to that particular question?
Well, I'll just say, Susan and Adrian spoke to the revaluation that has taken place at a very deep level of what works, what hasn't worked, what we would want to change. So I don't think we will go back to what was normal, and in some ways that might turn out to be a blessing for the types of changes and innovations that we've been able to undertake in a really short and dense amount of time. And I think this is really a space, as Adrian says, for the R&D and innovations and tech sector to really come up with some brilliant solutions. I don't know what those solutions are or might be, but I think we will get to experience just human ingenuity out of this problem that has developed. But as Adrian says, there's a lot of hope we should maintain in that.
Thank you. I've certainly always maintained that out of great constraint comes great creativity. And there is another little theme coming through, not so much in the questions, but a comment around the opening up and the participatory nature and the sharing that this COVID situation has perhaps accelerated and encouraging. And the point that's been made in the question post, although it's not actually question, is of course the other areas around Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledges, and in our case Aboriginal knowledges, and how there really is scope for that to be made into a much more two-way relational engagement. So thank you to the audience members for those comments. I'm going to go to one final question because I think that's all we've got time for, and it's a question around the role of government, and this time it's a funding question. So when you consider the inconsistency of government funding for creative organisations over the years, and of course in the university sector, certainly three of us in this Zoom are very well aware of the soon-to-be increase in fees for some students and some components of areas in the creative and cultural degrees. What do you think might be the long-term effects on COVID in the arts in Australia for funding? Perhaps, Susan, that might be one for you to lead off on.
This is a really important one. I'll just offer a point of clarification, and Jo, you can pick me up on this if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that actually a lot of the creative arts degrees haven't been particularly badly hit by this. Their fees have stayed fairly similar to where they were. It's the critical humanities subjects that are particularly hit hard. The people who are probably going to make the policy arguments to the government around the need to fund
humanities and also communications and journalism, which in many nations count as what constitutes creative industries, that is included.
And include screen and film and a lot of incredibly important sectors for the South Australian economy. There's good and bad news here, I suppose. I'm very worried for the short term. As I mentioned, this is a complex ecosystem of lots of small self-employed people. I am concerned that potentially quite a lot of those people will be lost for the next couple of years. The ray of hope, I suppose, is, but it's also a challenge, is that shift to an interest in arts and culture and creativity, and making the Museum of Democracy activity that Nikki Sullivan has pioneered, that Adrian spoke about, is one wonderful example of using technology to reach out to new audiences, to share skills. And I think there's a lot of that going on. And certainly in my research has shown that early exposure to making, to creating, to doing will tend to always lead into people in the creative sector moving into particular areas. Everyone I've ever spoke to in the creative sector can talk about as a child an experience of exposure. The risk here, I think, is in equating the joy around and the really strong engagement with arts and culture and creative activity by the community more widely with the development of really valuable but deep knowledge at a professional level. And so supporting people into maintaining or entering into serious level professional practice that takes thousands of hours to actually hone is one of the challenges that we're facing at the moment, and losing that expertise potentially.
Thank you. Thank you. I can't believe it. We're out of time. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their wonderful and most generous sharing of their own expertise, their deep knowledge, and their opinions and insights with us. I think we've pretty wholesomely covered the challenges, but I'm also have been really delighted and uplifted in the fact that each of our three panelists have also been able to identify the opportunities and what we can continue to do to nourish and sustain this most important sector. So a huge thanks to Adrian Franklin, Justina Jocham and Susan Luckman. And thanks to all of you, our audience members, for your participation today. I'm sure you found this just as stimulating and interesting as I have. It is a lot to digest, but as I said, importantly, there's so much information for us all to move forward with. So thank you all once again, and farewell.